Welcome once again to the program. More than 50 million people died in the Second World War, which lasted for 6 years, from 1939 to 1945. Another 20 million people died from war-related illnesses and from famine that was caused by the war. So more than 70 million people died as a result of World War II. Some countries were devastated. Many of their cities and towns, their homes, their infrastructure, their factories, their businesses were totally destroyed. So too was much of their agriculture. With the development of the atomic bomb, the weapons of war had become far more destructive and lethal than what had been deployed in the First World War, which took place 25 years earlier. As a result of all this devastation and destruction, the world came to the painful realization that another world war of that magnitude, especially with the development of more sophisticated weapons, would be so catastrophic that the very survival of planet Earth would be at risk. That was the backdrop against which the United Nations was formed in 1945, right at the end of World War II. Its principal purpose was to prevent another world war, to find a way and to put in place the appropriate institutional arrangements to maintain peace and security throughout the world, to provide mechanisms for resolving disagreements and conflicts, so that countries wouldn't have to take up arms, but through dialogue, mediation, and negotiation, they would be able to find a peaceful way to resolve those disagreements. With the war now raging between Russia and Ukraine, we must ask ourselves the question, is the United Nations serving that crucial purpose? We have had several wars since the UN was established. We have had the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. We have had several Arab-Israeli wars. We have had the Gulf War. We have had the war in Afghanistan, war in Chechnya, war between Bosnia and Croatia. We have had various wars between India and Pakistan, war between Iran and Iraq, war between Ethiopia and Somalia, and many others. Not to mention the long list of internal wars, civil wars. And all of these military conflicts have resulted in the death of millions of people. Millions who have died. Many more millions have been forced to flee their homeland, to spend years and years, some of them the rest of their lives, in refugee camps, depending on humanitarian aid, handouts, in order to survive. So we must ask the question, what went wrong? Why did the global arrangements, and that primarily means the United Nations Charter and its institutional arrangements, why did the system fail to avert these wars? Why did it fail to prevent the war now raging in Ukraine? For decades we were led to believe that we would never experience another world war. The devastation would be just too great. The kind of weapons that have been developed intercontinental ballistic missiles that can be steered while in flight to change trajectory and hit targets from thousands of miles away. Nuclear bombs that can be launched from land, from sea, even from submarines. Talk about weapons of mass destruction. That's what we're talking about. If we had really succeeded in guaranteeing peace and security, the billions and billions and billions of dollars spent on developing and maintaining these weapons of mass destruction, and the large standing armies that are trained to fight wars and to deploy these weapons of mass destruction, to kill, to destroy. All of those billions could have been used to develop the world, to eradicate poverty, to educate and train people, to produce food, to eliminate hunger and starvation. And if we had been able to do that, then Louis Armstrong's song about what a wonderful world would have been validated. And this is not such a wonderful world that we live in today. There are almost 7,000 nuclear bombs lying around, mainly in America and Russia, but also in places like China and Pakistan and India and North Korea and England and France. Based on the rhetoric coming out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what assurance do we have that if tensions between the military superpowers continue to escalate, that these weapons of mass destruction will not be unleashed and Armageddon will be upon us? It is a frightening possibility, but it is real. Vladimir Putin recently put his nuclear forces on alert to be ready to deploy nuclear weapons if America and NATO join the war in Ukraine. The American president travels around with a briefcase containing the codes that can be used to launch a nuclear attack. Once he activates the code, once he presses the button, nuclear missiles can be deployed within 15 minutes. Vladimir Putin, no doubt, has a similar control mechanism. What is going to happen when you have a Rambo-style somebody in either of those two positions whose mental state is subject? As some people believe, we have seen in recent times, both in Russia and in America. You know, we in Jamaica may be only a small fly on the wall, but if the wall is bombed, we will be destroyed. The United Nations system and other institutions designed to maintain peace and security were designed several decades ago in response to the situation and the circumstances that existed at that time, at that particular time in history. Question we must ask is, are they still fit for purpose? Do they have to be repurposed to address the situation that exists today? And if so, how do we repurpose them? The UN system is skewed. It's kind of weird, you know. Its most powerful organ is not the General Assembly, where all countries, including Jamaica, are represented and have one vote. It is the Security Council. The Security Council is made up of 15 members, each representing their particular country. 5 of them are permanent members: United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France. The other 10 members are rotated on a 2-year basis. And Jamaica, we have served on it in the past, but for 2 years. Each of the 5 permanent members has a veto power. So no decision can be made if any of those 5 members object to the decision or to the proposal. So if a proposal doesn't suit America or Russia or China or United Kingdom or France, it can't pass. When the Security Council tried to pass a resolution the other day condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia simply said no way. So it can't pass. Similarly, when on several occasions the Security Council attempted to pass a resolution condemning Israel's establishment of Jewish settlements in Palestinian territory, America said, no way. So it can't pass. The United Nations is not a world government. It has no power to compel any country or its government to do anything. It can only name and shame. And if a government has no shame, it is of no effect for it to be named. Vladimir Putin don't seem to be disturbed in any way by the overwhelming condemnation that has come in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, short of a world government, which is neither possible nor desirable, how are we going to maintain peace and security? How are we going to reduce, if not eliminate, the possibility that one day America or Russia or China will say, argument done. Enough is enough. We're going to do what we have to do, and we couldn't care less what the UN or the rest of the world has to say. And we couldn't care less what happens to them. The existential threat to peace and security in the world. That is what we're talking about today on Jamaica Live. Welcome back. It's 11:15, almost 11:16. We're on Jamaica Live. We're talking today about the global arrangements for peace and security, given what is taking place in Ukraine, but against in a wider context. The extent to which the arrangements that the world has set up to prevent wars, whether or not those are working, whether they are workable in modern times, and how secure we can be. And my first guest on the program, I'm so happy to have him, is Professor Paul Golding. And in introducing him, let me just say, to his great advantage, we are not related. But Professor Golding is a former dean of the College of Business and Management at the University of Technology. He's someone who has also taught at the Mona School of Business at the University of the West Indies, and I'm so happy to have Professor Golding join us for this discussion. He had a piece in the newspaper recently seeking to give bring some balance to the discussion regarding what is happening in Ukraine, putting it in context. And we can perhaps discuss that too, but I wanted to talk with him about the wider picture. How safe is the world today, given what we have seen happen, not just in Ukraine, but as I pointed out, the many wars that have taken place despite all of the arrangements that the United Nations has in place. Professor Golding, welcome to the program.
Good morning, and thanks for having me on the program. Before you ask me any question, I'd like to respond to what you said about us not being related. I've been asked several times if we're related, and I've often said I'm the poor relation.
But wait, you need to put both our bank accounts on the table before we can verify that. But thanks for joining me.
Yes.
Tell me, I've become very worried. Well, I must confess, you see, I'm getting an echo. I don't know if it's coming from your end.
No, I think it's coming from my end. 1 second.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it should be gone now.
Yeah, okay. I'm appalled at some of what I see on television. Let me put it in that context. That's what I see on not just CNN and so on, but Al Jazeera and BBC and Sky and so on. I'm appalled, but that is not even where my real worry is. My real worry is, for years I was under the impression that based on what took place in World War II, the 50 million people that were killed, the level of destruction that took place across so many countries, the establishment of the United Nations and all of its mechanisms, and importantly, the development of these real weapons of mass destruction that all of those who have them had come to the conclusion that these weapons are so dangerous that we dare not use them. So we only have them to make sure that they serve as a deterrent to each other. All of a sudden, I've been sort of woken up out of that complacency to feel that maybe we're not as safe as we used to be. What has gone wrong? Why have we had so many wars? Why did the Ukraine-Russia situation evolve if we have all these sophisticated mechanisms that are supposed to prevent this kind of military conflict?
You have given me a mouthful of things to respond to. Let me first put the current war into some kind of perspective for the listeners. In 1991, the USSR collapsed. And when the USSR collapsed, you only had one real superpower, which was the United States. When the United States collapsed, Gorbachev asked NATO, and when we're talking about NATO, we're generally talking about the United States, not to expand any further than where they were. There was a commitment given, and then it was reneged on, and it was there was expansion. The expansion has gone as far, or let me not put gone as near to Russia as Poland and Romania. The United States have established bases in these two countries that they say are for deterrent purposes. That's not the word that they use. For defensive purposes, that's the term that was used. In 2008, there was an agreement between, there was the Bucharest summit in which NATO said that they welcome Ukraine and Georgia they will welcome Ukraine and Georgia to NATO. And that all that was required, especially for Ukraine, was the membership action plan, or MAP. Russia responded by saying, listen, this can never happen, either to Georgia or to Ukraine. Immediately after that, there was a war in Georgia. And then in 2014, the Russia went in and took over Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine. Now we are in a situation in which what Russia is asking for is that Ukraine and Georgia should not join NATO because there is what is called in international political science of the threat perception. They consider that if Ukraine goes under the NATO umbrella, there will be this threat to their existence. And a result of that, there is war. But before I finish this point, so Russia is asking that, at least at this point, that Ukraine will remain neutral or under the sphere of influence of Russia. The United States and NATO says no. They should have self-determination and they should be able to make their own decisions. So this is why we are here now, because neither of the two parties are willing to compromise, and Russia sees themselves threatened, and they thought that they had no other option but to go into Ukraine.
But Paul, while I'm talking to you, I'm actually watching the television newscast. And what I'm seeing on the screen now is that the president of Latvia has called for a permanent U.S. military presence in Eastern Europe. In other words, what Latvia is saying is that we feel threatened by Russia. Russia claims that it feels threatened by NATO's encroachment. Latvia, and I suspect that Estonia would probably make the same claim. They feel threatened by Russia, and they want somebody to come and support them. Whose call is this going to be? And where is to come back to the context that I tried to set out at the beginning, where is the global system in all of this that would say, hey, NATO, don't do that. Russia, back off. Or is it going to be the nuclear weapons that will be the final arbiter of these issues?
Well, the final arbiter now when it comes to global politics is always a question of power. Politics is a mixture of force and consent. And oftentimes, if you have force, you're going to try and at least to exercise it. What has been the antidote to war so far is really the principle of deterrence, which is saying that, listen, I have nuclear weapons, you have nuclear weapons. If you attack me with it, there's going to be a counterattack, and we all will be annihilated. That has been what has been the major basis of there being no war. What we have there is a proxy war.
What is going to happen when you have somebody have a Adolf Hitler mentality in possession of the nuclear codes? And I have seen in recent times some leaders who seem to be approaching that state of mind. What's going to happen when some madman is in that position where they can exercise the codes? What's going to happen to me and you? I mean, where can I go hide? In Balaclava?
There's always been. By the way, I'd like to say that threat right now is very, very real, very, very real. With persons suggesting that there should be a no-fly zone. And Biden has responded very eloquently to say that if he enforces a no-fly zone, this is direct involvement between the United States and Russia.
But I'm not sure that if Ronald Reagan was president today that he would have responded that way, because he probably would have said, make my day.
Maybe. and maybe not, because of all of the interconnectivity with commerce and the world trade and all of that. It might have been different, because I really don't think any of them want a nuclear war, because they understand the consequences of it.
But how
I'm not sure if I answered your question, though.
Yeah, but where is the United Nations in all of this? Helpless, hopeless, inert, an onlooker?
The United Nations is really onlooker, you know. What you find is that other countries, like China, for instance, who have a lot of leverage, France, who is trying their best, Germany, who is also trying their best, and it's my view that France and Germany didn't want us to get to this point. For certain, they were more willing to compromise than the United States were willing to compromise. And the other nation that is trying to do something about this is Israel. So you have all these countries who are trying to defuse the situation.
But follow me now. Follow me now.
Go ahead.
Putin says that what he wants, his basic minimum position, almost non-negotiable, is that there must be a complete withdrawal of NATO military installations from Eastern and Central Europe. Now, where is that going to leave Poland and Romania and those countries? These countries are going to say, hey, you know, what you're doing is putting us right back under the thumbs of Russia. We escaped from that, and we have no desire to go back to that. How is that going to be resolved? Which is the table at which those combatants are going to be invited to sit down? It certainly doesn't appear to be the Security Council in New York.
No.
So the point I'm making is, whereas we thought we had got to a stage where we had a mechanism for dialogue, for negotiations, for mediation, that appears not capable of. It may be able to deal with the little skirmishes here and there, but it can't deal with these big-time conflicts. So is it going to be left just to the good sense of Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden? Is that where the future of the world now rests?
And China. But let me respond to the first part of your question.
Before you respond, I have to take a break. Can I just take a commercial break? Come right back to you.
Sure.
We're talking about global peace and security today. We have online with us Professor Paul Golding. Paul, I want to put something to you, and I want you to help me to see if I can meander my brain through it.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at a theater where we're not talking not just about Ukraine. You're talking about a situation where there are some countries in Eastern Europe, particularly countries like Belarus, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan. They want to be close to Russia. They're comfortable with that. But you have countries like Poland and Romania and Estonia, Moldova, Latvia, that are very fearful of Russia.
Yes.
So you have a situation where Russia is saying we want no military presence in this region. Countries like Poland and Ukraine and Romania are saying no, because that means if once that happens, by the next day we're going to see Russian troops at our doorsteps. Russia is saying, look, I can't afford to have these NATO military facilities with their warships and their fighter jets sitting on my border, because that is going to compromise my own security. How the devil are we going to resolve this? That's the first question. How are you going to persuade Russia that, listen, you have to allow these military facilities there, because that is what is going to give these countries the comfort that they need, and that is their entitlement. They ought to be assured that their security is protected. how are you going to convince these countries that, look, you can't expect Russia to put their own security at risk just for your own comfort? So that's the first question I put to you, and that comes right back to the kind of issues that you were raising in the piece you wrote in the newspaper. But the second issue is, at which table will all these matters be placed for discussion?
Let me look at your first question. We have a situation in which two parties have taken negotiating positions. Russia is saying we want all bases, military bases in Romania, Poland, and those places. We want them to be dismantled. That is not going to happen. NATO and the United States is asking back for Crimea. Not going to happen either. So those two positions are negotiating positions, and both parties know that neither of those is going to happen. The question now is, okay, what is the compromise? Because it requires a compromise, because hardline position is going to disrupt everything. So there needs to be a compromise on both sides. One, Russia needs to feel secure because they are not culturally and otherwise, politically and otherwise, they are not a part of the West. And they have no intention of being part of the West. At least under the current regime, they have no intention of being part of the West. At the same time, you have all these other countries who are threatened by Russia and do not want to. I mean, they're as Western as they can, as they become. I think that there are certain countries, especially Ukraine, that needs to be neutral. If Ukraine goes either way, and this was known from long ago, after 1991, it was known from long ago that if you went as far as Ukraine, there's going to be war. So countries like Ukraine need to be neutral, and other countries that seriously threaten the existence of Russia, because they also need the assurance of security, along with these other smaller countries too. Some of them part of NATO. So I really think that some countries, in order to keep peace, needs to be neutral. Or you go back to this whole sphere of influence politics, which still exists in it. There exists so much on this side of the hemisphere that nobody is going to come over here and set up any kind of base or anything like that. And in the piece I mentioned about Goat Island and China, and that would never happen. But let me go back to Europe. So I really think that this is where this is the position that should be taken for world peace. The other thing I think is that where should
but before you go further now, let us say that Ukraine were to decide whether the means of compromise or whatever. All right, we're going to be neutral in perhaps in the way that Finland is neutral militarily.
Right.
We're going to be neutral. Who is going to guarantee their security in that neutrality? Is it the UN? What is going to happen when some Russian leader decide, well, look, we want to set up a military base in Ukraine. To hell with that neutrality. We want to strengthen our borders. Who is going to guarantee that? I mean, I believe, for example, that the situation in Crimea, I believe that what really should be done is that the people of Crimea should be asked, do you want to link up with Russia? And if you want to link up with Russia, just redraw the boundary. Let them go. Don't hold on to them. If that is what they want.
That's not how world politics go. World politics is not so much dependent on what the people want. It is what the global powers want and their sphere of influence. That's how it boils down. We can look at it any other way. We want to, based on what we see coming on the news and what have you, but that's not how global politics work. World politics is based on power. If I need something and you have it, I'm going to come and take it.
Yeah, but the world is so integrated now that once they start firing off the weapons, What you have now is military conflict that is localized in Ukraine. But look at how it is affecting us here in Jamaica
Yeah.
in terms of movement in prices, disruption in the supply chain. Um, you
Gas
know,
prices,
yeah,
which
and we don't say anything yet. Now, if we were ever to talk about military conflict on a much larger scale, which is what is possible. I don't say it's going to happen, but when I hear some of the saber rattling, I get worried. Then it could affect us in ways that would make COVID look like a joke.
yeah. Just over the last 2 years, the threat to world order, one way or another, whether from health related or war related, is extremely grave.
But what frightens me is that the UN seems to have no greater capacity to influence what is going on than the 4-H club in Four Paths.
And truth be told is that they don't. They don't. Usually, what takes place at the UN is the appearance that, okay, this is where all the decision takes place. That's not where the decision takes place. It needs to take place, but as it is now, the US and Russia needs to have dialogue. The other persons who are having dialogue with them is not where it ought to be, because this is a proxy war between Russia and the United States, and Ukraine is caught in the middle, and they are the casualties in all of this.
Is it, to what extent does it have to do with an absence of leadership? And by that I mean, is it that the kind of diplomatic leadership that we saw, from people like Youthant and people like that, and even at the country level, is it that the leadership that would step forward and say, hold on, no, we can't do this? The leadership that would have had the kind of perceptiveness to say, no, this is dangerous. Is it a dearth of leadership?
The situation internationally has changed. You at one point you had several different poles of power. No, you still have, to some extent, some level of unipolarity, in which United States is the preeminent power. China is emerging, not at the level of the United States as yet, and therefore, even if you have leaders, at the end of the day, the leaders have to have some kind of military power for there to be any action, or economic power, in which is going to cause pain to somebody, and there's going to be mutual pain, and then what you have is some kind of compromise. Without mutual pain, there is no compromise.
Oh, I wish I could tell you that you have brightened my day.
You shouldn't have asked me that question.
Professor Paul Golding, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you very, very much. You have raised some very important perspectives, and we're going to be following those up in the rest of the program. Thank you so much.
All right, and thanks for inviting me.
Sure, you're welcome. We're talking about global security. Maybe what we should rename it global insecurity, and the fear of finding ourselves in a situation of global calamity again. We've been talking with Professor Paul Golding, former Dean of the College of Business and Management at the University of Technology. And we're going to be joined now by an outstanding, perhaps the most experienced Caribbean diplomat. He's the ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda to the United States and to the Organization of American States. I'm talking about Sir Ronald Sanders. He joins us not from Washington, where he's based, but he happens to be in the UK. At this time, he's joining us from the United Kingdom. Do we have him online? We don't have him online yet. I'm anxious to hear his views. As I said, he's perhaps our most experienced Caribbean diplomat. He has been at it for many, many years. He's an academic, but I think he's really established his credentials as in the diplomatic sphere, and I'm anxious to hear from him what his own thoughts are in terms of the capacity of the global institutions, the institutional arrangements, the United Nations in particular. What role can that kind of institutional arrangement play in averting the crisis that we are now seeing playing out in Ukraine? And why didn't it avert it? I mean, this is a question that we really want to ask. And we also have to see to what extent other organizations, like NATO, may have compromised the effectiveness of the United Nations. Sir Ronald, do I have you online?
I'm here.
Oh, Sir Ronald. So thank you very, very, very much for joining me. I'm sure you are.
My pleasure.
I'm sure, and you're speaking from London, I believe.
Yes, London over the next couple of days. Yes.
Yes. Tell me, is the United Nations fit for purpose, given what is taking place in Ukraine?
Well, certainly not the Security Council. And, you had asked me, Bruce, when you put this question to me to begin with, it's an intriguing question. Can the existing global institutional arrangements for maintaining peace and security be improved or strengthened to avoid the kind of conflict taking place between Russia and Ukraine? I pondered it for a very long time, and then I wrote one word: no.
Oh Lord!
And I'm afraid no is the practical and realistic answer.
So what's the alternative?
To the question, and right now, frankly I cannot see an alternative. The hostilities between the Western countries, led by the United States and Russia, are now so great, and the differences now so pronounced, that it's almost impossible to see how that divide can be bridged without a sea change. Actually, more than that, it will have to be a tsunami of change in terms of thinking and mindset.
But Ron,
as to how one approaches.
You have far more knowledge on these matters than I do. Haven't we been there before, or how did we get out of it?
Well, we have been there before and did nothing about it. That's the problem. It's not that we've been there before, we addressed it in some constructive manner. When, for instance, the United States went into Iraq and Afghanistan, that was in defiance of the rules of the international order. Now, nothing happened at that time because of the peculiarities of the relationship between Russia and the United States at that particular time in history. But it's a changing scenario, and what we've been seeing is the Western states looking at the matter of conflicts in states from a particular paradigm, in which they talk about the principles of international law, of peacekeeping, of fostering inclusive dialogue, of promoting democracy and human rights. But they themselves are hypocritical in how they approach that in many countries. So that approach has not worked. The Russians, in the meantime, have developed a different approach, which is putting authority, state authority over civil authority, putting the state over rights over the individuals, looking for order where people want discussion, and they're looking for that order by the use of force if necessary. And they've effectively done that in countries like Syria. and other places where they think that their own positions are threatened. And what has happened now with Ukraine is a complete and flagrant violation of everything that the UN Charter set out in Article 7, in Chapter 7, Articles 35 to 51, which, Bruce, as you know, have been in abeyance since 1947 and have remained in limbo ever since. Nobody even discusses Article 7 anymore.
But if we don't pull back from the brink, the crisis is not going to stop at Ukraine. After Ukraine has been conquered and brought under submission, who's going to be next? What's going to be next?
Well,
and let me go further. And let me go further.
Mm-hmm.
What is going to prevent any country with sufficient military power, and it doesn't have to be anything of the scale of Russia, what is going to prevent Venezuela from saying, well, now is our time to go and deal with the Guyana situation?
Well, the truth is nothing. And that is the great worry about what Russia has now done in Ukraine. Apart from violating international law, it has set a precedent for other little tin pot tyrants to try to do the same thing. And the problem is, the United States has to ask itself, when it's looking at this question, why did you not do something about Israel when it went into Palestinian territory and occupied it and then made settlements on it? Yes. Was that not wrong? And yet they turned a blind eye to that. Now, that's been happening all over the place for many years. So we do have to worry. And I said this last week, a week ago today, in a lecture I gave to the Royal College of Defence Studies in London, that it was about the Commonwealth, but it was to 100 people from 47 countries, only 40 of which were Commonwealth. But I was making the point that even in the Commonwealth, we have 7 potential conflicts that could happen tomorrow, could happen today. And once territory is occupied by some invading force, it is hell to get them out. And there is nothing, incidentally, in the current peacekeeping arrangements of the Security Council of the United Nations that can make them pressure those countries to release the occupied countries to territory that they occupy. Nothing. And they go in there as a kind of neutral force, not doing anything one way or the other. But that leaves people who have invaded and occupied in occupation of the territory that they've got. And that has to be the big worry for countries like Guyana with a military-type regime in office in Venezuela, or at least one supported by it. It's also a worry for Belize, whose entire territory is claimed by Belize, by Guatemala.
By Guatemala, yeah.
And then there's a Pakistan-India conflict over Kashmir, and then there's the Turkish ambitions to take over Cyprus. All of these are real issues.
I don't want you to leave me and my listeners in despair. What do we do?
Well, I tell you what we do as small countries. We stand on the side of what is right. I keep saying all the time that we in the Caribbean and our small countries around the world have no military might, no economic clout, but we do have a voice and we have votes and we have some moral suasion. And we have an obligation to ourselves, not only the countries that are invaded, but to ourselves, to ensure that international law is preserved and protected. But that is why I was so delighted that in the OAS, for instance, I led the resolution condemning the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine. I drafted that resolution myself and won the support of 25 countries out of 33 to get it through the OAS. That was on the 25th of February. Not all CARICOM countries supported, incidentally. Some of them operating under some idea that some of their allied countries may look at them with displeasure by standing up against this invasion, didn't support that declaration. But I was happy that come March the 2nd in the United Nations, all the CARICOM countries were among the 141 that actually voted for the General Assembly resolution at the UN when the Security Council of the United Nations was paralyzed. And here's the ridiculous situation about that United Nations Security Council. They were discussing Russia, and Russia was in the chair presiding over the discussion about itself.
Yes, I found
Now,
that.
what
I found that funny.
craziness is that?
I found that funny. But let me ask you.
It is absolutely craziness.
Let me ask you this in terms of the structural arrangements of. To what extent does the existence of organizations like NATO undermine, compromise the work of, say, the United Nations? To what extent are they compatible?
Well, I would have said it compromised it if Article 7 of the United Nations Charter was in fact implemented. People seem to forget that when this charter was written in 1945, Article 7 especially looked at the question of invasions and aggression and all of that and how it would be dealt with. And what it envisaged was the creation of some kind of military capacity for the United Nations under the authority of the Security Council and the Secretary General that would be put in place immediately as there was any conflict that occurred to go in and bring an end to that conflict. They very much had come out of the Second World War thinking, but when that a few years later, in 1947 to be specific, a committee was established of military people, incidentally, to look at how that thing could be, that mechanism could be activated. The political elements of the Security Council rejected it. And it has been in abeyance, in limbo since then, never to be done. So if they had put it in place, I would have said it had a conflict with NATO. But the fact that there is nothing at an international level, I can understand why countries will seek military alliances to protect the values that they hold dear and the principles that they think are important to the world. Now, remember that just after the Cold War, Russia itself joined with NATO forces to carry out peacekeeping operations. It has since pulled out of them. After Iraq and Afghanistan, it withdrew altogether. So it does nothing, and NATO became the enemy. And so, the point is that it would not have been in conflict had we, it would have been in conflict had we had a UN system. No UN system means these things emerge, because where there's a vacuum, Bruce, as you know, it will be filled by something. And it therefore became, in Russia's eyes, a threat to it, which is what lies at the base of this whole Ukrainian invasion. The fact that Ukraine applied to be a NATO country, and what Vladimir Putin saw was NATO sitting immediately on his doorstep with access to ensuring that his country did not have access to the sea, because back in Ukraine meant they would have gone back for Crimea, which is where a port that he desperately needs for Russia to get sea access.
Doesn't Putin? Isn't there some merit in Putin's argument that Russia's security would be at risk and would be threatened if NATO is able to virtually set up military installations on its border?
Well, there would be if that indeed was the intention. But here's the other side, the flip side of that argument, Bruce, and this is what we have to think about. If Ukraine is indeed a sovereign nation with the right to self-determination, surely it has a right to decide what it wants to join or what it does not want to join in its own self-determination. And if it decided that NATO is what it wanted to join, then why should a bordering country stop it from doing so? Because of its own fears, particularly as there are fears about something that has not happened and may never have happened. But in any event, I agree with you. The underlying thing is this. You recognize that Putin has a fear. Then what NATO should have done was long ago start the NATO nations just to start to address that fear. And part of what they might have said to Ukraine, for instance, is, look, in the circumstances, even though you've applied, and we understand that you have the right to apply, we don't believe it's either in your interest or ours or for peace in the world for us to do this. It will cause too much tension. Why could that simple conversation not have taken place?
Yeah,
unless it is...
Go ahead, Ron. Finish your point.
No, I was going to say, unless, of course, it wouldn't have mattered to Putin whether the conversation took place or not.
Well,
because there is a theory, of course, that he has more interest in reestablishing the old Soviet Union that he really has in stopping NATO being in Ukraine.
I'm wrestling with the thought that there's something that is missing. If it's not the United Nations intervention, and basically we seem to be saying that the United Nations, as it has been structured, really is a little more than an interested onlooker. Something though, Ron, seems to be missing. Is it that in the past, when we got to this kind of brink, there was somebody, maybe somebody whose name wouldn't mean anything to us, some kind of leadership at the diplomatic level that would be, running from Moscow to Washington and saying, hey guys, no, this is what you need to do. Is there anybody who commands the confidence of Putin and who has the ear of the State Department and the people in Washington? Something is missing. We can't be on the edge of what could be a third world war just so. What has gone wrong?
Well, I think that you've put your finger on the problem. The problem is one of leadership, not just necessarily by one man, but by more than one man or woman. It requires leadership at a very high level of political thinking. Unfortunately, Bruce, we are in the syndrome now where nationalism is trumping internationalism, but more than that, parochialism within countries.
Ron, I'm in trouble. I'm up on the 12 o'clock break. But it's an important thought. Can I ask you to bear with me? I'll get back to you in just a minute or two. We've been talking with Sir Ronald Sanders, the distinguished ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda to the United States and to the OAS. We're talking today about the threat to world peace, world security, all of what is playing out now in terms of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ron, when we took the break, we were onto something, and I want to explore it some more. Who is the person who is going to sort of step forward, step between, bring some sanity to the dialogue? When I listen, when Putin says, for example, he's quite open to dialogue provided all of his demands are met. Well, what kind of dialogue is that? Macron seems to be trying his best, but I don't know that he has the clout. Xi has clout, but he may be conflicted. Who is going to step forward?
Well, I fear that none of this is going to happen. Something is going to bring an end to it, but it is not going to be anything that leaves Ukraine with its territory intact or as a sovereign independent nation. My own belief is that the West is going to give up Ukraine for peace. In other words, they're going to sacrifice Ukraine to Putin's thinking. He is going to occupy the country, and he's going to run it as a Russian satellite. 2.5 million people have already fled from Ukraine. The estimates are that before this conflict is over the next couple of weeks, almost 4 million people would have gone. That's 10% of the population that we actually know about. Now, those people that have gone are people of all kinds, but they are particularly people who have the brains and the knowledge that could rebuild that place and and make it into something. But with that depletion of population, and if the place becomes occupied and run by Russia, Putin is going to send Russians into Ukraine. Eventually, there'll be a plebiscite, in my view, in Ukraine, which will say that the Ukrainian wants to be a part of Russia, and that will absorb that problem. Because what is happening as a consequence of this, and why the West is going to give up Ukraine, in my view, is that they are now under pressure in their domestic societies, as we will be in the Caribbean. We are already and will be in the coming weeks. Oil prices will go up, food prices will go up, the rate of inflation will go up, food shortages are going to happen, and the West can't stand that discomfort. Their own people can't take that discomfort. So they're going to raise up and argue against their own governments. And to keep them satisfied, Ukraine will be the sacrifice. Putin will get his own way on that, and hopefully they may contain him after Ukraine is gone. But I suspect Ukraine is going to be the price for what they will call peace. But all it will be is paying the price for Putin to get his own way on this. But the world order is never going to be the same.
But isn't it?
I will.
Go on.
No, I agree with you, Bruce, about the question of good leadership and leadership that can look at this thing differently. But where is that thinking coming from? You just pointed out that the main players right now don't have that kind of thinking in mind. China is sitting on the sidelines of this argument because, in part, watching the West and the East destroy themselves is in China's interest as far as Xi sees it. And don't forget the Chinese have a much longer view of world history than people in the West and Eastern Europe have. But I suspect that is what is going to play out here.
But wouldn't that situation simply whet Putin's appetite? I mean, what would then happen to Latvia and Estonia? Why would he stop at Ukraine?
I agree with you. There's no reason why he should. But at that point, it is a question as to whether the West is able to cripple his economy sufficiently for him at least to pause and to start to review this situation, because he's not going to come out of this skirmish without serious economic difficulties himself. And nobody is talking about this in the way they're talking about the refugees leaving Ukraine. But people are running from Russia too. And the people who are running from Russia are the ones who are internationally saleable and can go into other parts of the world and find jobs easily. But that's a brain drain for him. In addition to that, the treasure that he has used on this has to be replaced somewhere. The beating he's going to be take if, in fact, they stop buying his oil is also going to be a problem for him. He, too, has a constituency to satisfy. The last thing he wants in Russia is a dissatisfied population. He's managed to keep enough of them convinced at this time. I mean, the propaganda is really quite remarkable. He's even managed to convince some of them that Ukraine is shelling itself, that it's the Ukrainians who are blowing up cities in Ukraine and not Russia. That's how far the propaganda has gone. But
he has also been able to build up quite an immunity against discontent.
Yeah, as long as his soldiers stay with him.
Yeah.
And he's one man. He needs the military to stay there. And the question is going to be, how long is the military going to stay with him? Now, I've seen reports. I don't know how true they are, and I can only buy what I see in the international media. But I've seen stories that his own soldiers are not well supplied, that the lines are too far for them to keep them in food, and that they've had to salvage on their own. In Ukraine, they've even gone into homes begging for food. That sons have been sent back to Russia in tears because they're in a war they don't want to fight and have no need to do, and many of them are running too because of the fear of conscription in Russia itself. All of these stories are emerging. So he doesn't himself have a very comfortable situation in Russia.
And
the longer that this continues, the more discontent there will be.
Did you see the same report I saw today, which I don't know if it's fake news, that Russia was seeking assistance from China for drones?
Yes, I saw that, and I saw the Chinese say it was fake news.
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of assistance they would be seeking from China, quite frankly. And by the time China mobilized any kind of assistance, military assistance, that could be of any use to Russia in this particular conflict, which is being fought in the most cowardly fashion. It's not soldiers fighting soldiers. It's large arsenals of missiles being pelted on countries, on cities, and blowing them up, killing innocent women and children in hospitals, pregnant mothers, all that kind of thing. So I don't know what use China would be in all of this, but I think the Chinese, by announcing that it was fake news, were sending a signal too.
Yeah, well, it struck me as odd. I mean, I don't know that if Russia is talking to China about some military cooperation, that you and I would hear about it in that kind of way. But tell me, you have seen you have seen some of these military conflicts play out before. I am appalled. I mean, I could understand if Russia, because of all its security concerns, was targeting the military installations in Ukraine, basically crippling Ukraine's military capabilities, and then putting Ukraine in a position where, they would have to be submissive. But the sort of, when I see bombs being dropped on residential buildings, I mean, this looked like the kind of thing that was taking place with Nazi Germany. I don't recall seeing that in other conflicts. Or am I wrong?
Well, no, it did take place, I'm afraid it happened in Afghanistan. It happened in Iraq. It happened in Iran. It happened in Syria. In fact, Syria was worse, where they used chemical weapons too. And the Soviet Union contributed to that, whether they never admitted it, but I think the world knew that was the case. So these weapons have all been deployed from time to time in conflicts which did not have as much publicity as what is happening in Ukraine. And, I have to say that I have a sense of sympathy with I wrote an article that condemned this, but I remember it sometimes it comes back to haunt me. But there were people in the Caribbean who were saying, why are we getting involved in this? It's a white people war. And I had to point out to them myself that it may be a white people war, but it has consequences for black people. And that is why we have to be concerned about it. We can't look at this just in racial terms. But the reality is that there have been situations in which the worst kinds of atrocities have taken place, where people have been bombed and killed, and drones have been bombs have been dropped on them, and never a single word of it reported in the press. We didn't look at it day by day on global television from CNN and the BBC and everywhere else as we are looking at this particular thing. And when you listen to the Europeans themselves talk about this, how do they describe it? They say this is not a third world country. This is in Europe with people with blonde hair and blue eyes like ourselves, as if almost saying that it's acceptable when it happens to black people, but not to us white people. We shouldn't be doing this. It's a kind of idiotic sense of racism that enters into all of this stuff. And unfortunately, when we look at it, we say, well, you were bombing the hell out of people elsewhere. You didn't publicize it, but you're publicizing this. And it makes our people, therefore, want to take a side that is not the Ukrainian side, not the side of the West. But we have to, not because of those racial reasons, not because we feel umbrage at the fact that they think, well, this should only happen to black people, or it has only happened to black people in the past. No, the truth of the matter is, you look at the history of war, and there's been a history of white people killing white people since before the Second World War. But we've been schooled to think that is not how it is. But the reality of the situation is that we have to be concerned about any war because we are small, because we are economically weak, because we are dependent on exports and imports. We need a stable world in which to survive.
And the world is interlinked in a way that it wasn't, certainly not at the time of World War II.
Precisely. And today, with our reliance on tourism, we have to figure out much more expensive it is going to be for airplanes to fly. In a situation where oil is not will reach $200 to $300 a barrel, and we are almost at the 200 barrel level. The price of getting on a plane is going to be so prohibitive, very few people are going to be able to afford it. So it is in our interest to see an end to this conflict, and for peace to exist in the world. But Bruce, to come back to the point of leadership, and again, and I agree with you, that it requires a body of leadership that is committed to morality, to ethics, to principles, and to the concept that we live in one planet in which all humanity is interlinked, and therefore conflict should be brought to an end as quickly as possible. That national interest is best served by a peaceful world. That is the thought. Now, let's go back to South Africa, to South Africa for a minute and apartheid. I doubt when we were fighting apartheid that we would have brought an end to it at the time that we did, had not a bunch of white men in the Commonwealth decided to stand up against Margaret Thatcher, who was continuing to insist that no sanctions should be placed against apartheid South Africa. And who were those white men? Bob Hawke of Australia, Brian Mulroney of Canada, joining with, these are two big white guys, and standing up saying, no, this must come to an end. And they joined Rajiv Gandhi of India and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and saying to Margaret Thatcher, we, white and black people, say you are wrong on this. And that started the process of putting the pressure on Pretoria, on South Africa, on the white regime. But it does need leadership with a bigger vision that goes beyond race, that goes beyond religion, and recognizes that the interlink that you talk about in our globalized world needs peace and no conflict for all of us to survive and improve the quality of our lives.
Good note to end the discussion on. Sir Ronald Sanders, thank you so very much. You have brought some very insightful comments to the discussion. I must tell you, you have left me a little less hopeful than I had hoped. But we'll watch and see how it plays out.
We mustn't give up hope.
Yeah. Thank you so very much, Sir Ronald Sanders, Ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda to the United States, and one of the Caribbean's most experienced, most distinguished diplomats. We take a break now. We've been talking today about global security. Maybe global insecurity, because I think the world has reason to feel insecure in a way that it perhaps hasn't done so in my lifetime. We thought that we had got to a stage where we might have skirmishes here and there, but war of the kind of scale that we saw in the middle of the last century we wouldn't see again. I'm not so sure that I can rely on that anymore. And one of the persons who are going to help us understand not just what is happening, but why it is happening, and whether or not there's something that needs to be done, something that can be done to prevent this kind of thing from happening again, is Professor John Rapley. He's a distinguished academic, currently based at the Cambridge University in England. He's also a senior fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies in South Africa. But John is no stranger to Jamaica. He taught here at the University of the West Indies for more than 10 years. He was a regular columnist in the Glean, I think it was. And he is one of the founders, and I think he was the first director or president of Capri. He joins us from the United Kingdom. John Rapley, welcome to the program.
Hi, Bruce. Good to see you.
When last have you been to Jamaica? Why have you sort of just torn up your Jamaican?
No. I would never, ever tear up. As you know, Bruce, you were one of the very first people I told when I actually became a naturalized Jamaican citizen. I can remember the day still that evening. and I would never tear that up.
When last were you here?
I haven't been in Jamaica for, well, it's been a long time. I was there 6 years ago, and
Oh, Lord.
I've just been everywhere else, but my heart is always there.
Book a flight. Book a flight and come.
Of life.
We're always glad to see you. John, I'm
That's
worried.
good.
I've been talking today about what is going on in Ukraine, but in what I think is even more important context. Some of us perhaps would have been distraught in the discussions I had a short while ago with Sir Ronald Sanders, who you probably know. He's of the view that Ukraine is going to fall, that the West is going to basically resign itself to giving up Ukraine, and hope that in doing so it can bring an end to the current conflict and turmoil. I'm not sure that will happen. I'm not sure that will not simply encourage Russia and Putin to line up the forces and hit some other country in Eastern Europe. But the broader issue, what is it that failed, John? Why did this happen? We seem to be so close to a kind of conflagration, military conflagration that may go far beyond, that could go far beyond Ukraine. Did we have systems in place to try to avert this and prevent it? Well, what failed? What went wrong?
I think the thing we have to bear in mind, Bruce, is what makes this such an unusual conflict is you cannot separate what's going on from the mind of one man. It's a highly unusual situation. We can look at the objective factors which created tension in the region, but in this is a case where Vladimir Putin, who has concentrated power in his own hands and has become increasingly remote, and this seems to have been intensified as a result of the pandemic. He's become a very distant dictator, if you will. He doesn't take much counsel. That staged meeting with his National Security Council shortly before the invasion, you could see his own security advisors were more or less being bullied into agreeing with him, but were clearly uncomfortable with it. And it seems very likely a situation where there's just nobody telling him that this is a crazy idea. And he wrote that infamous essay, of course, which basically made the argument that Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist.
Sounds like you're talking about Adolf Hitler, though, John.
I'm sorry?
Sounds like you're describing Adolf Hitler.
Well, it's not unlike Adolf Hitler in that you have a similar situation, that you have somebody who has persuaded himself that he's the most brilliant military commander around, doesn't take the advice of his generals, and makes serious errors. And it's very clear that they made some very serious errors. And, one analogy, Bruce, I think one can make to Hitler is that in the same way, when Hitler invaded Russia, he didn't equip his soldiers with winter clothing because he said they'd all be back by Christmas. And of course, the Russians, as they've done many times in their history, used their so-called strategic depth and withdrew far inland, waited for the winter to kill off most of the German army, and then beat them back relatively easily. Relatively at a massive loss of Russian and Ukrainian lives. It's important to bear in mind that Ukraine was on the front line of that war. Putin sent his soldiers in with only a few days' supply of food and fuel. And as soon as they bogged down north of Kiev, the supply lines broke down. Soldiers, there's all sorts of reports of them basically looting filling stations, looting finding any food they can because they've run out of food. Morale is very low. The soldiers weren't even told where they were. We have those reports that circulated online, videos of soldiers asking Ukrainians for directions, not sure what they were doing. It has been an absolute mess. And I think this is all down to one man. The difficulty for him is that having committed and having more or less staked his reputation and his authority on victory, he can't now possibly back down, but it's going very badly. I would disagree with my old friend, Ron Sanders. And I would say, I think there's a very likely scenario that Ukraine collapses in the sense that the formal resistance collapses, the government goes into exile or it retreats into a rump state in Western Ukraine, but then continues to operate low intensity warfare in the form of guerrilla warfare, turning it into an Afghanistan scenario. That for the Russians would be pretty dire. That looks like a conflict they cannot win. Given that Putin did not really mobilize support for this war at all, he doesn't even call it a war in Russia, of course. It's just a special operation, meaning it's only supposed to last for a few weeks. If you can imagine a scenario, which I think the Ukrainians are prepared to prosecute, of prolonging this potentially for years, with every day a few more Russian soldiers being killed and a few more tanks being blown up, and the Russian economy in a pretty poor condition. Bear in mind that in the 20th century, unpopular wars brought down not one but two Russian governments. Both the Tsarist regime and the Soviet regime was brought down by unpopular wars. And one thing a Russian leader can't afford is to have a war drag on with lots of deaths, because the propaganda simply stops working. I mean, when we talk about the Kremlin maintaining a stranglehold on information, I mean, it was nothing compared to the stranglehold on information which the Kremlin had under the Soviet regime. But the fact is that eventually enough soldiers come home in body bags, or come home wounded, or come home traumatized, or don't come home at all. And neighbors start talking. People are aware of this. This tragedy hits home. This is not something people signed on for. So I think that is the real difficulty. Therefore, I'm actually a bit less pessimistic than some. I think Russia will have an interest in somehow bringing this to a close sooner than later. I think what they are aiming to do is to so weaken the Ukrainian government that they gain the upper hand in the negotiations that are going on. I'm not sure that's going to work. The Ukrainians, in many ways, seem to be gaining with every passing day. They seem to be gaining more and more advantage, but it remains to be seen. Those negotiations are ongoing.
What merit, John, do you attach to Russia's argument that the constant extension of NATO's military footprint constitutes a serious threat to its own security? Isn't it understandable that Russia would feel threatened if it's looking at the possibility of a Ukraine becoming a NATO member and having serious military armaments located right on its border? And come back to the real topic of the discussion today. Why did the global institutional arrangements fail to confront this issue? Are we at a point where the United Nations, it wasn't set up primarily for education and culture and population control. It was set up for peace and security. It's costing over $3 billion a year to keep it going. How do we address? It seems to me, from my simplistic vantage point, it seems to me that Russia has an argument. Ukraine also has an argument. Ukraine is entitled to self-determination. But in all of this, let's sit at a table. Let's work out something that would make everybody feel comfortable, if not victorious. But that failed. Why did it fail?
Again, I think, interestingly, I was always a strong critic of NATO enlargement, and I did say it was provocative. I said, if you put it in the context of Russian history, whether or not you think Russia's concerns are legitimate, the fact is, and I always would encourage my students, if they wanted to get a sense of this, is don't look at a Mercator projection of the world. Look at a globe from the North Pole down, and what you see is a country, Russia, that has historically on all sides, been surrounded by hostile countries, and has always felt itself threatened, and has always wanted, therefore, to have a near or broad, a buffer zone. And that the expansion of NATO was a deliberate provocation that was bound to go badly. I guess what you could say, though, is in the last few weeks, my sympathy for the Russian position evaporated because his behavior, Putin's behavior in Ukraine, underscores the argument that countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Czech Republic, Poland, and of course Ukraine have all been making, which is this is exactly why we want to belong to NATO, because Russia is this expansionist power. Moreover, if he had simply said, I'm going to intervene until Ukraine agrees not to join NATO, he could have sustained that argument. But because he's now made this argument that Ukraine has no existence, and he's been trying to carve it up into using dubious claims about the treatment of the Russian minority, which interestingly doesn't seem to enjoy support within the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine, which increasingly, well, very strongly now identifies with the Ukrainian state. He has completely undermined his own argument and the legitimacy of his claims. I think in terms of you mentioned the United Nations, and you said it wasn't set up for the purpose of population control and cultural exchange and on all the rest of it. And ironically, those are the things it's done fairly well. When it was set up for security. And you're right. I mean, in a sense, it has no reason to exist at the moment in its current architecture. And it may well be in crisis. It may well collapse altogether, just as the League of Nations collapsed over its failure to prevent what happened, the coming of the Second War. And, it is in desperate need of reform. It's very difficult to reform. It's not clear it will be reformed. It's not clear that the major powers in the world even want it to be reformed. So it's a troubling time. There's no question. What I do think is that a few weeks ago, there was a narrative emerging.
John, can you just hold that thought? I have to take a commercial break. Come right back to you. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. We go up until 1 o'clock Jamaica time, 2 o'clock New York time, and we're being heard, of course, in the New York area. We've been talking with Dr. John Rapley. The topic for today has been this state of the world in terms of its peace and security, and what sort of assurance we have, and what kind of assurance we thought we had in preventing major military conflagration. When we took the break, John, you were talking about the United Nations and its probable unreformability. You want to finish that point?
Well, I just think that, as it is, that the idea of the principle of giving great powers a veto is a sensible one. But we can see the problem is that given that the great powers are the most powerful and therefore the most potentially the most damaging, when they act, there's no stopping them because they have a veto. And so time and again, the Security Council has found itself unable to really act in a way that can prevent this kind of behavior going on, not just on the part of the Russians, but on the part of other great powers as well. As we well know, the kind of depredations we're seeing in Ukraine are not unprecedented. They may be unprecedented in the complete cavalier openness with which Russia, for example, is targeting civilians, rather than saying it's accidental. But we've seen this before, and the United Nations has simply not been up to the task. And I think that really is a question that will have to be asked: does it have a role in the future? As I said, as you said, there's an awful lot that the UN system does well. But most anybody who works within the UN system can tell you it's sluggish, it's bureaucratic, it's a lot of sinecures. It's not as effective as it would like it to think it is.
You spoke earlier about the political situation in Russia, and Ron Sanders also raised that. How secure is Putin in terms of his control? Is it is that control so muscularly determined that a simple muscle spasm and he could be out of control? I mean, he could lose that control.
I think for the time being, he's very secure. He's all the people around him are loyal to him, are in deep. People talk about could there be a military coup? And the answer almost certainly is no, just because the Russian and before that, the Soviet armed forces have a long history of professionalism and not involving themselves in politics. And so the idea that and of course, at the most senior ranks, they're very loyal. I think in the short term, he is fine. And then the other thing is you get what you get in virtually any political system. I think too much has been made of recent polls in Russia finding that 70% of the population support Putin. And there was the Atlantic Council put out an article which was saying this just shows that it's not just Putin, it's Russians. And I think that's actually a very weak argument. The fact is, in any country, in any political system that goes to war, you always have a rally around the leader in the immediate and in the short term, just because of a sense that we have to band together. It's a question of security. It's pretty much an instinct. The problem becomes if the war drags on and continues going the way it is, and with the economy in its current state, Russia is going to, life for ordinary Russians is going to become very difficult. And they haven't been mobilized. Opinion has not been mobilized around a long war. They haven't even been told about a war. It's more or less been an afterthought. And as I say, if this drags on for months or worse, for longer, if Russian soldiers are there for years, the government's saying there's nobody there. And in fact, as I say, people know people in their own network who've lost sons in this conflict, or sons who've come home without limbs or unable to speak, or all the other horrific things that can happen in these kind of wars. Then you can envision a situation where support for the regime really does begin to weaken. Economically, moreover, Russia is being hit very hard by these sanctions. And I think if the response, which I think there's a good chance the response in the West will be to accelerate the transition to a green economy and to reduce the dependence on fossil fuels, Russia it really should be seen as a rich third world country. It exports minerals, it exports grains. It doesn't export that much in the way other than military technology, which isn't actually a moneymaker for them. Putin had staked a great deal of hope in the idea that they could rather, like these Gulf monarchies, they could sort of use oil money to build, like Dubai, build other sectors in the economy. And he was staked a great deal in the idea that they would develop a high-tech sector. That wasn't really going anywhere. And now it's collapsed completely because thousands of tech entrepreneurs are leading the exodus out of Russia. So that is going to be great for the economy of Finland. It's going to be great for Silicon Valley. It's basically locking Russia into a long-term dependence. And for as long as it is isolated from Western markets, it will become even more dependent. It will turn into a Chinese client state. It will become a secondary player. And the price that China will almost certainly demand in the long run is a greater say over its activities. They won't want Putin engaging in this kind of adventurism without their permission in the future, or without actually having a direct say. It's going to be a very humbling, very humiliating future. That's where I think ordinary Russians could say, this is not at all what Putin promised. And I think in the long term, he could become undermined.
You mentioned earlier that Putin, he miscalculated in terms of supplying his troops and how long he thought that this thing would last. Did he also miscalculate in terms of the response of the Ukrainian people? Was he expecting, when he moved into Crimea, there were a lot of people who were embracing the soldiers. Was he expecting that kind of response from the rest of Ukraine?
Apparently, he expected, and again, reports we get from captured Russian soldiers were that they were expecting more or less a parade. This is down to one of two things: either a massive intelligence failure. The much vaunted Russian intelligence gathering apparatus is not what it used to be, or they were gathering this intelligence, sending it back to Moscow, but as for the reasons I discussed earlier, nobody was telling Putin. And the result is he was just getting an echo chamber telling him everything you think about Ukraine is true. They don't, a big chunk of the population wants to be part of Russia. There's very little evidence, and it's in the public domain. You don't need spies to work this out. You just have to look at the results in the most recent election. Pro-Russian parties got 8% of the vote. Look, the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, is a native Russian speaker, but he identifies with Ukraine. The fact that they speak Russian doesn't make them necessarily want to be part of Russia any more than somebody who speaks German in Switzerland doesn't want to be part of Germany. They want to be Swiss. So I think it was he lived in a bubble. He lives in a bubble. That bubble is become increasingly remote. He doesn't get out at all. When he meets, these bizarre distancing practices he has when he meets with people, he's become obsessive, germaphobe in the extreme. And, leaders that become that remote, that's sort of like, Tsar Nicholas II, never leaving the court and thinking the Russian people loved him when they were massing outside in demonstrations. I think there's a real problem with that kind of delusion. So I can see in the longer term, if it were to drag on, that where I think change would come would be really in a turn away from the system, popular protests, silent forms of protest, people not paying taxes, people, the kind of things we're all too familiar with in Jamaica when you don't like the political system, so you just make excuses. You don't say what's in your suitcase when you get to the airport because you think the money that's collected by the government is wasted anyway, and all the rest of it. These things that can really undermine a state's authority. That is the danger, I think.
John, let me ask you this. The United States, big power broker with all its apparatus for strategic thinking. Has the United States made a great strategic blunder in alienating both Moscow and Beijing at the same time? Why you want to take on these two powers? I mean, Biden went to the EU and conscripted them to help him to start putting on sanctions on China. Why you want to fight China and Russia at the same time, and you have the possibility of a Ukraine kind of situation emerging?
Bruce, to be honest, if I took a really sort of cold-blooded, realist perspective, and when I talk about realist, I talk about the approach, in foreign policy where you say, I don't care at all about morality. I just care about national interests and what's going to advance the interests of my country. And if I think that way from the point of view of a Washington foreign policy advisor, I would say no. I think the United States has actually come out of this much stronger. Two reasons. First of all, it has exposed the myth, which was very powerful. The belief in Russian military superiority has been exposed. It's showing, first of all, it's weakening by the day. Every day that it has tanks, aircraft, helicopters destroyed, it can't very quickly and very easily replace that lost material. It is weakening as an armed force, and it's also showing itself to be really incompetent in battle. 3 members of the general staff, 3 line officers have been killed in combat. Now that's an extraordinarily high number. That shows that the problem is local commanders are not up to the task of adapting their tactics. And so generals having to go to the front lines to help them do this. And that shows serious weakness on the part of our military. So I think on the one hand, it exposed Russia's weakness. The other thing is that the surprising unity of the West around these sanctions isolates China. China simply cannot afford for this conflict to go on for very long without suffering a severe economic blow. You just look at what happened in the Chinese stock market today. There's a real panic starting to set in. And I think Xi Jinping made a blunder by aligning himself too closely with Putin specifically, not with Russia, but with Putin. And now he's stuck with him. And Putin is the worst sort of ally, someone who's unpredictable, who's rash. And then he's sort of like, he's sort of like that kid who goes and picks a fight and then runs back to you to bail him out, but then a whole gang is chasing after him. This is what Xi Jinping faces. So I actually think that at the moment, the United States is emerging in a very strong position because of the blunders on both the part of Putin and Xi Jinping. I mean, it's been handed this as a gift, not because of any strategic brilliance on Biden's part. My hunch is that the Chinese and the Americans, because of their mutual economic interests, and also the fact that China's continued dependence on, well, there's two things. It's continued dependence on the dollar as a currency of trade in a country that's heavily dependent on trade. And also, I think it has changed its view of Taiwan, that the confidence with which it was approaching Taiwan, it's now seeing that if it were to try and launch an invasion as Russia has done, and it encountered the same sort of opposition in Taiwan that Putin is encountering in Russia, the situation will become far more complicated. And I think it would rather have not had this kind of scenario played out. Had Ukraine collapsed quickly, China and Russia would have emerged in a strong position. But because Ukraine didn't collapse quickly, by the day, I think it weakens their position.
If we were to return to this discussion, John, in 6 weeks' time, what do you think we'll be talking about?
It's impossible to say, Bruce. What I hope we'd be talking about is the peace deal that's been reached out of necessity between a ravaged Ukraine and a humiliated Russia, that somehow gives both of them something with which to save face. But as I say, Putin is acting like a desperate character. It's very difficult to say what he would do. Nobody, even intelligence couldn't possibly penetrate his mind. There's just no way of knowing what he's going to think. And the protocol for launching nuclear weapons in Russia is such that even against the advice of his generals, if he really wanted to do it, he could. I think it's a real stretch, but he's acted so erratically that we can't rule out a catastrophe. I continue to err on the side of hope. I don't think that will happen, but who's to say what could happen?
Do you think that there's anything that could emanate from Russia's side that would cause NATO to respond?
Yes, I think NATO's position has been clear. If they're not going to engage in Ukraine, but that if there is an attack on a NATO member, a clear attack. Now, I think in the first instance, if Putin were to try to widen the conflict into the Baltic republics, for example, he wouldn't do it with an open attack. He would try and do it with some kind of special operatives who are operating undercover or mercenaries to make it so that he has plausible deniability. But I do think that what NATO is going to have to do, and I think what the White House will have to do, is draw its own red lines in the sand very clearly, because Putin, I think, is going to continue pushing to see how far he can take this. And once they draw those lines, I do think that the likelihood of a response, and as I've said, tactically, operationally, you have a weakened Russian army, a demoralized Russian army, and it's also exposed, they're getting sort of real-time intelligence, just observing this conflict and figuring out what the Russian weaknesses are. If you compare, for example, when did the Americans, after a long pause without fighting, go back to war? That was in the first Iraq War. And I think, most strategic specialists would say the army performed fairly well. The generals were fairly, they showed themselves to be up to the task. If you compare Russia's performance in this first real war after a long period, it has not done well. And so I think it would be reluctant to engage NATO directly. I think it would only target NATO states if it believed there wasn't going to get a NATO response. So I think Putin will have to sort of tread gingerly on that one. I think he's going to talk a tough line. I think he's going to be a lot more reluctant to act. Interesting point, and that's where we're going to have to end it. John Rapley, so thank you so much for joining us today. You have added value to the discussion. You could add a lot more value if you buy a plane ticket and come back to Jamaica. You're a Jamaican citizen. I'd love to. I'd love to. Never say never. I look forward to seeing you, John. Thank you so much for being on the program today. Pleasure. And that brings us to the end of the program. Another
episode of Jamaica Live. We'll be back next Monday, hopefully, with another topic. We're a single issue program, focus on an issue and try and make sure that we help you to understand it. And I hope that we did that today. Thank you so much. Thanks to my producer, my studio engineer. Thanks to my listeners. Thanks to Beauregard, and thanks to all the listeners in New York as well who join us for this endeavor. See you next week.